January 1943. Northern Luzon, Philippines. Night settles heavily over the jungle, swallowing sound and light beneath layers of thick tropical canopy. Moist air clings to uniforms already worn thin by months of hiding. Somewhere beyond the trees, a Japanese patrol moves cautiously along a dirt road carved into the hills, their boots pressing into mud softened by recent rain. Not far away, a small group waits in silence. A young woman emerges from the darkness, her clothes indistinguishable from those of a village farmer. She carries no weapon, only a folded piece of paper wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Hours earlier, she had walked through an occupied town, passing checkpoints, bowing politely to soldiers who never suspected she carried the patrol's route, timing, and numbers. She kneels beside the guerrilla commander and hands over the message. Within minutes, positions are chosen. Rifles are raised. The ambush is set before the patrol even knows it has been watched all day. Across occupied Asia, scenes like this were becoming increasingly common. Japanese commanders faced an enemy they could not easily identify: civilians, farmers, and often women. And to understand how this hidden war began, the story must return to the moment the occupation first took hold. December 1941 reshaped the balance of power across the Pacific in a matter of days. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Imperial Japan launched a sweeping offensive across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific, striking simultaneously at American, British, and Dutch territories. The strategy was precise and ambitious. Eliminate Western military presence quickly, secure vital resources, and establish a defensive empire stretching thousands of miles across ocean and jungle. The Philippines stood directly in the path of this expansion. An American Commonwealth since 1935, the islands held enormous strategic importance. They guarded sea routes between Japan and the resource-rich territories of the Dutch East Indies. American airfields and naval bases there posed a constant threat to Japanese supply lines. For Tokyo's military planners, neutralizing the Philippines was not optional. It was essential. On December 8, 1941, only hours after Pearl Harbor, due to the international date line, Japanese aircraft struck Clark Field and other American installations. Much of the U.S. Far East Air Force was destroyed on the ground. Within weeks, Japanese troops landed in multiple locations, advancing rapidly against American and Filipino forces commanded by General Douglas MacArthur. The defenders fought delaying actions but faced overwhelming disadvantages. Japanese forces possessed air superiority, experienced combat units, and coordinated amphibious operations refined during earlier campaigns in China. Supply shortages quickly weakened Allied resistance. By January 1942, American and Filipino troops withdrew to the Bataan Peninsula, hoping to hold out until reinforcements could arrive. Those reinforcements never came. After months of starvation, disease, and relentless assault, Bataan fell on April 9, 1942. Tens of thousands of exhausted soldiers were forced into captivity, beginning what became known as the Bataan Death March. Weeks later, the island fortress of Corregidor surrendered. Organized Allied resistance in the Philippines officially ended. But the war itself did not. Japanese occupation authorities moved quickly to establish control. Military governors replaced civilian administration. Curfews were imposed. Radios were confiscated. Public gatherings were monitored. Food production was redirected toward Japanese military needs, creating shortages among civilians already struggling after months of conflict. At first, many Filipinos hoped occupation might bring stability after chaos. Japan promoted its campaign as the liberation of Asia from Western colonial rule, presenting itself as a partner rather than conqueror. Propaganda posters promised independence and cooperation under what Tokyo called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Reality proved different. Economic disruption caused inflation and hunger. Suspected collaborators and resistance sympathizers faced arrest, imprisonment, or execution. Japanese military police, the Kempeitai, developed a reputation for harsh interrogation methods aimed at suppressing dissent before it could organize. Yet suppression produced an unintended effect. Across the islands, former soldiers who had escaped capture disappeared into mountains and jungles. Local leaders quietly preserved hidden weapons. Farmers shared food with fugitives despite severe penalties. Communication networks began forming without centralized planning, built instead through trust among families and villages. The geography of the Philippines favored resistance. Thousands of islands, dense forests, steep terrain, and remote communities made total control nearly impossible. Japanese garrisons held cities and main roads, but vast rural regions remained only loosely governed. In these spaces, something new emerged. Not a formal army, but scattered groups united by survival and resistance. Former officers reorganized small units. Scouts observed troop movements. Messages traveled secretly between towns. Intelligence slowly began flowing toward Allied command structures that still existed beyond Japanese reach. At this early stage, resistance remained fragile. Weapons were scarce, ammunition limited. Many fighters lacked training. Direct confrontation with Japanese forces often ended disastrously. Success depended not on strength, but invisibility. And invisibility required people who could move freely through occupied society without attracting suspicion. Individuals capable of carrying information, supplies, and coordination across enemy-controlled territory. Unexpectedly, some of the most effective participants in this hidden war were those least anticipated by Japanese military doctrine. As occupation deepened, women across the Philippines began stepping into roles that would quietly transform guerrilla warfare itself, a development that would soon reshape how the resistance operated and how Japanese commanders understood the enemy they faced. By mid-1942, resistance in the Philippines had shifted from scattered survival groups into something more organized. The surrender of conventional Allied forces did not end loyalty to them. Instead, it forced the war underground. Former soldiers, local officials, teachers, farmers, and students began forming guerrilla units tied together through informal networks rather than centralized command. Communication became the lifeline of this new battlefield. Japanese forces controlled ports, major towns, and transportation routes. Patrols searched for weapons and fugitives. Checkpoints appeared along roads connecting provinces. Any man of military age traveling without explanation risked detention. Under these conditions, traditional military movement became nearly impossible. Women, however, occupied a different social space within the occupation system. Japanese military doctrine, shaped by earlier campaigns in China, focused primarily on armed male resistance. Soldiers were trained to watch for former troops, suspected scouts, or organized bands of fighters. Civilian women were often perceived as non-combatants engaged in domestic survival, gathering food, tending families, or working local markets. This assumption created gaps in surveillance that resistance networks quickly recognized. Women began serving first as messengers. A folded note hidden inside a basket of vegetables could travel farther than any armed courier. Information about troop movements, supply convoys, or patrol schedules passed quietly between villages. Some women memorized messages entirely, carrying nothing physical that could be discovered during searches. Others transported medicine, ammunition, or radio parts concealed beneath clothing or household goods. These tasks required extraordinary composure. Discovery meant imprisonment or execution, not only for the courier, but often for entire families accused of aiding guerrillas. Yet participation expanded steadily as occupation hardships deepened resentment toward Japanese rule. Gradually, responsibilities widened. Teachers organized intelligence circles among students. Nurses secretly treated wounded fighters after dark. Market vendors tracked which Japanese units arrived or departed each week. Widows and mothers offered safe houses where guerrillas could sleep briefly before moving again. Information gathered through ordinary daily routines became military intelligence of surprising accuracy. Some women moved beyond support roles into operational leadership. In remote provinces such as Panay, Luzon, and Mindanao, resistance units lacked experienced officers after early defeats. Civilian organizers, including women with education, local influence, or logistical skill, began coordinating supply chains and communication routes. Leadership in guerrilla warfare often depended less on rank than on trust and reliability. Those who could maintain networks became indispensable. Radio communication marked a turning point. Hidden transmitters allowed guerrilla groups to contact Allied command in Australia. Intelligence gathered locally now reached strategic planners preparing for future operations in the Pacific. Reports described Japanese troop strength, airfield construction, coastal defenses, and shipping movements. Many of these reports depended on information collected or transported by women. The Japanese military gradually noticed patterns they struggled to explain. Patrol routes were ambushed shortly after being planned. Supply convoys encountered resistance in areas believed secure. Guerrilla units appeared informed about movements that should have remained confidential. Counterinsurgency measures intensified. Villages suspected of aiding guerrillas faced searches and reprisals. Identification papers were checked more frequently. Informants were recruited. Yet the resistance adapted faster than occupation forces could respond. Because guerrilla warfare blurred the line between civilian and combatant, every marketplace conversation and every rural path became part of the battlefield. Women carrying food or walking between villages might also be mapping terrain, counting soldiers, or coordinating attacks timed to minute details. By late 1943, Japanese commanders increasingly described the Philippine countryside as unpredictable and hostile. Control existed during daylight patrols, but faded at night. Intelligence failures multiplied. Units moved cautiously, even in regions officially pacified. The occupation had produced an enemy that could not be easily confronted, decentralized, patient, and deeply embedded within civilian life. What began as survival had evolved into organized resistance sustained by networks invisible to conventional military thinking. And within those networks, women were no longer simply participants. They had become connectors, planners, and, in certain regions, leaders guiding guerrilla actions themselves. The hidden war was growing more confident, setting the stage for clashes that would reveal how profoundly this transformation challenged Japanese authority across the islands. Angle 1. Human perspective. For the women of the Philippines, participation in the resistance was rarely a choice framed in glory or honor. It was survival, responsibility, and defiance rolled into one. A teacher in a small northern village might leave her classroom before dawn, not to prepare lessons, but to memorize the movements of Japanese patrols. A mother carrying water to her home could slip a folded message beneath the container, knowing that discovery could mean execution. Each step, each glance over the shoulder was calculated. Fear was constant, but so too was resolve. Courage was quiet, measured, and relentless. These women carried the burden of protecting not only their families, but an emerging network that would determine the success or failure of local guerrilla efforts. Daily life became the battlefield itself. Markets, schools, churches, and rivers, ordinary spaces, were transformed into operational zones. A seamstress passing fabric to neighbors might also be noting the presence of Japanese soldiers and reporting their routines. A nurse tending to illness might map the terrain around a village, memorize weak points in local patrols, or relay that intelligence to guerrilla leaders. Every domestic task was layered with purpose, with strategy built into survival. Their actions were often invisible, but their impact was undeniable, quietly undermining Japanese control. Emotion ran deep. The women were motivated not only by patriotism or vengeance, but by an acute understanding of the stakes. Failure could lead to collective punishment. Fear, grief, and hope intertwined in a relentless rhythm. Even amid terror, moments of ingenuity and solidarity emerged. Shared tasks built trust, and trust built the invisible backbone of a resistance that the Japanese military could not easily perceive. Angle 2. Tactical perspective. The Japanese army was trained to engage conventional forces. Its doctrine assumed identifiable units, predictable supply lines, and clear hierarchies. Guerrilla warfare conducted by civilian networks shattered these assumptions. Women, often underestimated by Japanese commanders, became critical nodes in a decentralized system. They relayed information, coordinated ambushes, and distributed supplies. Their mobility allowed guerrilla cells to strike unexpectedly and vanish before reinforcements could respond. Tactical success relied on invisibility and timing. Women couriers carried details of troop strength, patrol schedules, and ammunition stores. Guerrilla leaders then used this intelligence to plan small-scale ambushes, sabotage operations, and diversions. Roads, rivers, and mountain passes became lethal traps, designed not with brute force, but with precision guided by real-time intelligence. The Japanese, unfamiliar with this decentralized communication network, found themselves reacting to threats that seemed to appear from nowhere. Additionally, terrain played a tactical role. Women familiar with local villages and jungles could navigate paths undetectable to the Japanese, allowing the guerrilla network to maintain an upper hand despite having fewer weapons. Their knowledge of agriculture, village layouts, and local customs provided the guerrillas with operational advantages, enhancing both mobility and surprise. Each success was small in isolation, but cumulatively, it eroded the Japanese sense of control. Angle 3. Intelligence and communication. In guerrilla warfare, information was power, and women became its primary carriers. Couriers moved messages across occupied territory, often memorizing intelligence to avoid leaving incriminating evidence. Messages included troop movements, supply routes, and Japanese unit schedules. Some operated hidden radios, transmitting critical data to Allied command units in Australia or to distant guerrilla cells. These transmissions helped coordinate broader operations, ensuring that sabotage, ambushes, and local uprisings occurred at the most strategic moments. The Japanese struggled to trace the flow of intelligence. Every intercepted letter or document led to frustration. Every failed ambush on Japanese convoys reinforced the perception of an omnipresent, invisible network. Women leveraged cultural assumptions. Japanese forces rarely suspected civilian women of organizing resistance, granting them an operational advantage that proved decisive. Their work blurred the line between civilian and combatant, challenging conventional definitions of warfare. Through these intelligence networks, resistance units could synchronize actions across provinces, creating pressure on Japanese supply chains and communication lines. Every ambush, diversion, or act of sabotage was informed by data collected and delivered by women who risked everything simply by moving through the occupied landscape. Their contribution transformed isolated guerrilla actions into a coherent campaign capable of influencing regional Japanese strategy. Angle 4. Japanese perspective. For Japanese commanders, the rise of women-led resistance posed a challenge that defied conventional military logic. The army was trained to identify threats based on uniformed opposition or armed male fighters. A woman carrying baskets of rice, tending livestock, or walking along a jungle trail rarely triggered suspicion. Yet intelligence reports, ambushes, and sabotage operations increasingly suggested a persistent, organized enemy operating just beyond their perception. Commanders grew frustrated as guerrilla attacks disrupted supply convoys, communication lines, and local administration. They ordered stricter patrols, increased checkpoints, and harsh reprisals in villages suspected of aiding insurgents. Still, the network proved elusive. Even experienced officers struggled to predict where attacks might occur. Japanese records from 1943 to 1944 frequently note the unreliability of information gathered from local populations, reflecting an anxiety that grew in proportion to the effectiveness of the resistance. Women, often invisible in Japanese assumptions, became a source of unexpected and unsettling intelligence. This psychological dimension of warfare created tension beyond material losses. Japanese soldiers reported growing unease when moving through territories where civilians, particularly women, might be observers, informants, or guides to armed guerrillas. Fear and uncertainty slowed operations and reduced the Army's confidence in territory it nominally controlled. Angle 5. Leadership and Organization. Women in guerrilla networks did more than deliver messages. They organized, coordinated, and sometimes commanded operational cells. Leadership did not require formal military training. Instead, success depended on trust, knowledge of local terrain, and the ability to motivate others under extreme risk. In northern Luzon, several women coordinated dozens of operatives, directing movements of small strike teams to harass Japanese convoys or sabotage communications. Their organizational skills extended to logistics. Supplies, food, medicine, and ammunition were routed through networks women controlled, ensuring fighters could maintain mobility despite limited resources. This decentralized command structure allowed resistance cells to adapt rapidly to Japanese countermeasures. Traditional hierarchies were less effective in these environments. Women often provided the connective tissue that transformed scattered actions into coordinated campaigns. Leadership, in this context, was as much about resourcefulness and reliability as it was about strategy or rank. Angle 6. Psychological and Moral Impact. The presence of women in guerrilla warfare had profound psychological consequences for both sides. For Japanese troops, fear stemmed not only from ambushes or sabotage, but from the realization that the civilian population could not be relied upon. Even in villages that appeared calm and obedient, Japanese officers could not assume loyalty. The uncertainty created a constant state of vigilance, lowering morale and eroding confidence in occupation authority. On the other side, the involvement of women strengthened the moral backbone of the resistance. Communities saw ordinary individuals, mothers, teachers, nurses, participating actively in defending territory and protecting lives. Their courage inspired broader participation and fostered unity. The knowledge that women risked everything reinforced the legitimacy of resistance operations and highlighted the profound human cost of occupation. The psychological interplay of fear, resilience, and determination set the stage for increasingly audacious operations. Guerrilla units, now aware of their strategic value, began coordinating with Allied forces in preparation for larger offensives. The invisible yet indispensable role of women became a turning point, one that Japanese commanders could neither easily anticipate nor counter. The growing coordination, intelligent success, and psychological pressure laid the foundation for decisive actions that would alter control of occupied regions. Small victories accumulated, guiding the resistance toward a pivotal moment in 1944, when information, strategy, and timing converged to challenge Japanese authority in a way that would change the course of occupation warfare. By early 1944, the Philippine resistance had evolved into a coordinated network capable of influencing the broader Pacific campaign. Japanese commanders, once confident in their occupation, now faced a persistent, unpredictable force operating in both rural and urban areas. The cumulative effect of intelligence delivered by women-led cells had become impossible to ignore. In northern Luzon, for example, guerrilla units had mapped Japanese troop positions, supply depots, and patrol schedules with remarkable precision. Couriers, often young women traveling alone through mountain trails, delivered intelligence daily. Commanders relied on their ability to remain undetected, memorizing details of enemy movements, radioing updates to distant operatives, and coordinating ambush points. Each successful message increased the operational confidence of guerrilla cells and the corresponding anxiety among Japanese units. One notable pattern emerged. Japanese convoys frequently ran into prepared ambushes along routes previously thought secure. Bridges were destroyed just hours before reinforcements could arrive. Supply trucks were sabotaged without warning. Officers reported that attacks seemed to anticipate movements they had carefully planned in advance. Official military logs described the frustration in precise terms. Patrols intercepted nothing but traces, supplies vanished under observation, and soldiers faced threats from civilians previously considered harmless. The women who orchestrated these operations were the linchpins of success. A nurse in northern Luzon coordinated safe houses for fighters, maintained communication with other cells, and delivered intelligence about upcoming Japanese movements. Her knowledge of local terrain allowed guerrilla squads to strike at optimal moments, avoiding unnecessary risk. Another, a schoolteacher in a central province, organized community surveillance, documenting Japanese patrol patterns and transmitting that data to resistance leaders who used it to schedule sabotage operations. Japanese attempts to adapt often backfired. Increased patrols and curfews sometimes alerted the resistance to Japanese priorities, enabling guerrilla cells to exploit predictable patterns. Harsh reprisals against villages suspected of aiding fighters galvanized local populations instead of intimidating them. Communities concealed intelligence, hid weapons, and facilitated movements. The combination of local knowledge, stealth, and coordination rendered Japanese forces reactive rather than proactive. By mid-1944, the psychological pressure on Japanese commanders had reached a critical point. Reports from occupied provinces repeatedly highlighted the unreliable nature of civilian cooperation and the difficulty of predicting guerrilla action. Commanders increasingly hesitated to commit troops to routine patrols, fearful of ambushes. The presence of women in operational roles added to this uncertainty, as their civilian status made detection difficult and intelligence collection highly effective. Strategically, the resistance was not simply surviving, it was shaping the battlefield. Intelligence delivered by women-led units informed Allied planning for the eventual return to the Philippines. Operational details regarding airfields, shipping movements, and garrison strength were used by the United States and Philippine Commonwealth forces to design amphibious assaults and coordinate supply drops. The covert network effectively transformed the islands into a partially mapped theater, with Japanese forces forced to defend against threats they could not fully observe. The cumulative effect of these operations came to a head during early reconnaissance for the Leyte invasion. Women couriers and organizers provided critical information about coastal defenses, inland troop movements, and local resources. Their intelligence enabled guerrilla units to prepare safe corridors for Allied forces, conduct diversions, and sabotage infrastructure that would impede Japanese response. Japanese commanders, already stretched thin, were now confronted with an enemy capable of striking at both material and psychological vulnerabilities, an enemy they could neither easily track nor suppress. By this stage, the role of women in resistance operations had transformed the nature of guerrilla warfare in the Philippines. Their courage, discipline, and strategic contributions created a cascade of small victories that eroded Japanese authority and set the conditions for the Allied return. The invisible hands of these operatives shaped the battlefield long before the first invasion ships reached Leyte Bay, demonstrating that warfare was no longer confined to soldiers alone. Civilians, and particularly women, had become essential architects of victory. The stage was now set. The intelligence, sabotage, and coordination that women had maintained would converge with Allied operations in a way that Japanese forces could not anticipate, a convergence that would redefine the occupation and expose the limits of their control. October 20th, 1944, Leyte Gulf. The largest amphibious assault in Philippine history began, and with it, the culmination of years of guerrilla intelligence and preparation. While Allied naval forces approached the eastern coast under a protective screen of air power, resistance networks inland were already in motion. Japanese commanders, who had long dismissed civilian populations as passive, were confronted with a coordinated campaign that blurred the lines between conventional and irregular warfare. Women-led guerrilla units were at the center of this effort. In towns and villages behind Japanese lines, they guided Allied operatives to hidden routes, safe houses, and critical supply points. Couriers delivered precise information on troop deployments, artillery positions, and garrison rotations. Fields were scouted, bridges assessed for sabotage, and patrol schedules mapped. These details, painstakingly gathered over years of observation, provided Allied commanders with real-time intelligence that allowed them to anticipate Japanese reactions and deploy forces efficiently. In the mountainous provinces, guerrilla squads struck preemptively. Supply depots were destroyed, communications lines severed, and patrols ambushed, forcing Japanese units to divert forces from defending the landing beaches. The timing was crucial. Every act of sabotage delayed reinforcements, creating gaps that Allied troops exploited upon landing. The Japanese, expecting standard military resistance, instead faced a multifaceted threat: conventional assaults on the beaches and guerrilla operations behind their lines, synchronized with remarkable precision. The psychological impact was immediate. Commanders reported confusion among troops unable to locate the sources of sabotage. Convoys disappeared overnight, and villages previously thought loyal were now staging points for ambushes. Officers admitted in post-war records that the presence of women operatives was unsettling, as their civilian appearance provided a mask for activities that disrupted military planning. Even seasoned soldiers, trained to anticipate enemy maneuvers, found themselves reacting to an unseen and unpredictable adversary. In one documented instance, a resistance group, led by female organizers, coordinated the destruction of a critical bridge near a supply route connecting Lady's northern highlands to central garrisons. Japanese units attempting to respond were delayed by hours, leaving reinforcements stranded as Allied troops established a foothold on the beaches. This operation, among dozens orchestrated by women and their networks, directly contributed to the weakening of Japanese defensive cohesion. Simultaneously, intelligence relayed by women ensured that Allied units avoided areas of concentrated resistance that could have led to unnecessary casualties. The synergy between local guerrillas and invading forces amplified operational effectiveness. Japanese commanders, unable to predict these actions, faced the compounded effects of tactical miscalculations, disrupted supply chains, and collapsing morale. Their strategic position became increasingly precarious, with Japanese forces reacting defensively rather than asserting control. By the end of October, the Leyte campaign had demonstrated the full impact of women-led resistance. Guerrilla operations had delayed Japanese reinforcements, protected civilian populations from indiscriminate reprisals in certain areas, and provided actionable intelligence that directly influenced Allied strategy. The occupation's control was fragmented. Japanese commanders were forced into reactive positions, struggling to maintain authority over a territory increasingly dominated by an invisible, resilient network. These months marked a turning point not just in the Leyte campaign, but in the broader struggle across the Philippines. The Japanese had underestimated the capability, resilience, and strategic importance of women operatives. Their roles in intelligence, coordination, and direct support of guerrilla operations had shifted the balance. Where once Japanese forces moved with confidence, they now acted cautiously, aware that every village, market, and jungle path could conceal observers or operatives ready to disrupt operations. The culmination of these efforts made clear a new reality of warfare. Victory was no longer solely determined by numbers, firepower, or territory. Knowledge, coordination, and the courage of those operating behind the front lines could decisively shape outcomes. The courage of Filipino women, often unseen and unheralded, had directly influenced one of the largest military operations in the Pacific theater. As the beaches of Leyte were secured and Japanese resistance began to crumble, it became evident that the guerrilla networks had not merely survived occupation. They had altered the operational environment in ways that even seasoned commanders could not anticipate. Their actions paved the way for further Allied advances, demonstrating that the power of organized resistance, when led with intelligence, courage, and determination, could reshape the course of war. By early 1945, the Philippine archipelago was increasingly under Allied control. The Leyte landings, supported by intelligence and sabotage operations coordinated by resistance networks, had marked a decisive shift. Japanese forces, though still entrenched in pockets across the islands, were no longer able to project authority with confidence. Supply lines were fragmented, communication networks compromised, and morale diminished. Reports from Japanese garrisons frequently described a pervasive sense of unpredictability, with officers expressing frustration at being unable to trust civilian information and at the constant threat of ambushes orchestrated by those they had underestimated. The contributions of women within guerrilla networks were particularly noteworthy. Couriers, intelligence operators, and organizers had ensured that key information reached Allied planners in time to influence strategic decisions. Japanese attempts to suppress resistance often backfired. Villages that experienced reprisals became more cautious, concealing activities and providing protection to operatives. Women's participation was integral to maintaining these networks. Their civilian roles provided cover, while their organizational skills allowed guerrilla units to act with precision. Beyond intelligence and logistics, women also shaped tactical outcomes directly. Guerrilla forces, often operating in small groups, executed ambushes, sabotage missions, and diversionary attacks with the coordination made possible through female leadership. Bridges were destroyed, communication lines severed, and convoys intercepted. Each of these operations, while minor in isolation, collectively undermined Japanese operational capacity. Their efforts delayed troop movements, disrupted resupply efforts, and contributed to the overall erosion of Japanese control across rural regions. The Japanese military, previously confident in its occupation strategy, faced mounting operational and psychological pressures. Conventional tactics proved increasingly ineffective against an adversary that could disappear into the landscape, blend with civilians, and strike unpredictably. Officers documented growing unease at the realization that women, once dismissed as peripheral actors, were now central to the resistance infrastructure. They had become connectors, leaders, and facilitators, capable of shaping both the flow of information and the timing of guerrilla operations. From the Allied perspective, the impact of these networks was profound. Coordination between local guerrillas and invading forces allowed for targeted operations that minimized Allied casualties and accelerated territorial gains. Intelligence about Japanese positions, fortifications, and movement patterns provided a crucial advantage in planning amphibious assaults and inland operations. The success of these campaigns relied as much on the bravery and strategic acumen of civilian operatives, particularly women, as on the firepower and coordination of conventional military units. The aftermath of these operations left the Japanese military significantly weakened. By mid-1945, Japanese control over the Philippines was largely confined to isolated garrisons, many of which were cut off, undersupplied, and demoralized. Guerrilla networks, still operational, continued to provide intelligence, facilitate Allied logistics, and maintain local security. Their sustained effectiveness underscored a new understanding of warfare, one in which civilian participation, decentralized networks, and intelligence coordination were as decisive as conventional combat strength. The role of women in these operations, often overlooked in broader narratives, demonstrated the capacity of individuals operating outside traditional military hierarchies to influence outcomes at both tactical and strategic levels. Their courage, resourcefulness, and determination had helped shape the course of the Philippine campaign, revealing a dimension of World War II that challenged Japanese assumptions about gender, combat, and occupation. As Allied forces consolidated control over the Philippines, the contributions of guerrilla networks and the women who sustained them became more visible. Post-liberation assessments by U.S. and Philippine Commonwealth forces highlighted the critical role of intelligence in operational planning. Reports repeatedly acknowledged that information provided by resistance operatives had allowed invading units to anticipate Japanese movements, avoid heavily defended areas, and secure key terrain with fewer casualties. The coordination achieved by these networks was described as remarkably efficient, a testament to the organization, discipline, and courage of civilian operatives. The psychological effect on Japanese troops extended beyond immediate military setbacks. Officers and soldiers reported a pervasive sense of uncertainty that lingered even after defeat. Many had underestimated the capacity for civilian resistance, particularly from women, to influence the battlefield. Memoirs from the period describe a sense of disbelief at how intelligence and ambushes appeared from nowhere, highlighting the effectiveness of female-led networks in shaping operational outcomes. For Japanese command, the realization that women could organize, coordinate, and execute guerrilla operations challenged deeply ingrained assumptions about the roles of civilians in occupied territories. In liberated communities, women who had served as couriers, intelligence operatives, and coordinators receive recognition from local authorities and allied forces. Although formal military accolades were rare, oral histories and post-war documentation celebrated their courage and ingenuity. These accounts reveal the immense risk undertaken daily, moving through hostile terrain, carrying critical intelligence, and facilitating operations under threat of execution. The presence of women in leadership positions within guerrilla networks also inspired broader participation from communities previously hesitant to engage directly in resistance activities. The material consequences of resistance operations were equally significant. Japanese garrisons were systematically weakened, supply lines disrupted, and local infrastructure, when strategically targeted, rendered the enemy less capable of regrouping. Guerrilla actions forced Japanese forces into a reactive posture, limiting their ability to contest Allied advances effectively. These operations not only safeguarded civilian populations but also ensured that the Allied advance toward Manila and other key urban centers was better informed and more strategically guided than it might have been otherwise. Beyond the immediate military impact, the role of women in guerrilla warfare had lasting social and cultural implications. Their participation challenged prevailing gender norms, illustrating that leadership, courage, and strategic acumen were not limited to men or uniformed soldiers. Communities that had witnessed their efforts began to reassess perceptions of capability, authority, and resilience. Post-war analyses acknowledged that the success of resistance operations in the Philippines would have been markedly diminished without the active and sustained involvement of women. By mid-1945, as Japanese forces capitulated across the islands and the Pacific War drew to a close, the lessons of civilian resistance were clear. Intelligence, local knowledge, and the courage of individuals operating in non-traditional roles could decisively shape the outcome of military campaigns. Women's contributions, often invisible during the occupation, had created structural and operational advantages that directly influenced the speed and effectiveness of liberation. The aftermath also set the stage for post-war reflection. Historical records, memoirs, and community histories began to capture these narratives, emphasizing that victories in the Philippines were not solely the product of conventional armies, but the culmination of decades of preparation, courage, and sustained risk undertaken by civilians, particularly women, who transformed occupation into an arena for resistance. Their legacy endured, shaping both military understanding and social recognition of women's roles in conflict. The foundation laid by these operations naturally leads to a reflection on what this struggle meant, not only for the Philippines, but for the broader understanding of warfare, intelligence, and human resilience. The story of women-led guerrilla operations in the Philippines illustrates a profound truth about warfare. Battles are fought not only with guns and artillery, but with courage, intelligence, and human ingenuity. In a landscape dominated by the machinery of occupation, ordinary civilians, mothers, teachers, nurses, became architects of resistance. Their actions blurred the line between civilian and combatant, showing that the capacity to influence conflict extends beyond formal armies. Japanese commanders, trained to confront conventional threats, encountered an enemy they could neither easily see nor predict. Women operated in plain sight, leveraging cultural assumptions, local knowledge, and unwavering courage to coordinate intelligence, sabotage, and communication networks. Every ambush, every disrupted supply line, every intercepted message revealed the limits of occupying forces' control and reshaped the operational environment. The invisible hands of these operatives transformed the islands into a contested space where intelligence and coordination mattered as much as firepower. The broader significance extends beyond military strategy. The contributions of these women challenge societal assumptions about gender and capability, demonstrating that leadership, initiative, and strategic influence are not confined to uniformed soldiers. Their courage inspired communities, strengthened morale, and created operational advantages that directly influenced the course of the war. In doing so, they left a legacy that resonates in both military history and cultural memory. Ultimately, these actions remind us that war is experienced not only on battlefields but in the quiet, perilous choices of individuals. The women of the Philippine resistance exemplified resilience, ingenuity, and courage in the face of danger. They transformed fear into action, invisibility into influence, and survival into strategy. Their story endures as a testament to the power of human agency, demonstrating that even in the darkest hours of occupation, determination and intelligence can alter the course of history. The bravery of these women not only helped liberate their country, but also redefine the understanding of resistance, proving that the fight for freedom is as much about those who move unseen as those who advance on the front lines.